Okay, dear Minister, Arctic friends. How many are Arctic friends in here? Raise your hands. Okay, how many feel a bit concerned today about the Arctic? Raise your hands. That's great. So how many feel it's very important that we actually have a report looking at Arctic resilience? Raise your, okay. So the seminar is a full success. We can now tweet. Everybody's happy. That's great. Welcome to this important seminar. We are so happy. And I would say that really on the behalf of the two, you could say, implementing organizations, the Stockholm Resilience Center at the Stockholm University and the Stockholm Environment Institute, but with extreme support from the Swedish government, the US government, and so many colleagues around the world that has been working so hard with this report over the last 5 years, actually. And today it's here, and we can say that it did arrive at good timing, to be honest. As you noticed, and many of you I'm sure have noticed, there has been a lot of writing about what is happening in the Arctic right now, with average or with temperature at 20 degrees above normal in some areas in the Arctic, which is of course extreme. So this is timely, this report. If you want to tweet, these are the two hashtags. That there are two hashtags means that we couldn't come to a conclusion. We couldn't come to a consensus. This is quite typical for the Arctic, to be honest. Many actors are there, and it's sometimes difficult to reach a consensus. But at least we only have two. So these are two. If you really want to make a splash on the Arctic and the flow of information there, hashtag Arctic, and link to the report ARR.2016. And I just wanted to show one picture. This one I grabbed from the internet just 10 minutes before we started. You have all seen this many, many times. And it's very symbolic today because you can see the extent of the sea ice, the blue line, measured against the extreme year that we had in 2012, the dotted line, and what is normal and average from 1981 to 2010, which is the full line there, and what you can expect as a deviation from normal. And you can see that we are now below the most extreme year that we have measured. So this is timely. This is happening right now. This is a picture from today. And if you have a chance to read the article in The Guardian that came on top today, actually referring to this report, which is wonderful, they also pinpoint one other scary thing, and this is the fact that one of the key agencies in the world to monitor and track changes, NASA, they are under threat of losing quite substantial funding for their environment research as well. And this is based on these capacities. So we have to make sure to focus on the Arctic, on the role of science, technology, research as we move forward. We don't have all the answers, and policymakers definitely need good advice still. Anyway, I will soon let the seminar start. The only thing I would like to do is that today you will meet a minister, you will meet professionals that have been working with the report and many of the scientists, but there are also a lot of people working behind the scene. And I'm sure on the US side, maybe Joel, you can mention a few people on your side that has actually been supporting the process. But on the Swedish side, I also would like to mention Jeanette Krantz, who has been completely instrumental all through this process. And actually also through the difficult times when we did, even in Sweden, sometimes have difficulties to mobilize the political support because the Arctic feels quite distant. But you believed in the project and you have really helped us a lot. Fredrik Hannertz, is he here? No? Fredrik Hannertz, now at the Foreign Ministry, but otherwise earlier at the Ministry for Environment, who was instrumental when we started this whole thing. Andres Jato, the Arctic ambassador, has been working extremely hard with us to make sure that the report is really on the political agenda, not least at the Arctic Council meetings, but also being active all through. Marianne Liljesköld at Naturvårdsverket, Swedish EPA, earlier also extremely instrumental in all this. And I also would like to mention the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Stockholm Resilience Center communications teams, because they have been so instrumental in pushing really the information out, and supporting this seminar today, not least, very important role. Resilience is not easy to communicate sometimes. Isn't that true? It's a tough job, but today we're here to do so. So without further delay, you have seen this, you know it's urgent, you know that we have to really get things moving. And in order to get things moving, you need politics, you need brave politicians. That's the thing. And Sweden is, we are full of brave politicians, just standing there ready to take action. And to illustrate this, I would like to invite our Minister for Environment, Karolina Skog, from the Ministry of Environment and Energy. A warm applause. Go on. Yes.
Thank you. And I would like, of course, to say, is it on? Yes?
Yeah.
To welcome you all to the Ministry of Environment and Energy in Stockholm. It is fantastic to see so many of you here, and we are here to participate in the launch of the Arctic Resilience Report. It was back in 2011 that the Swedish government took the initiative to produce this report. 5 years of hard work had led us to this moment. But, of course, the hard work is far from over. This report will help us, though, to bridge science and policy. And I believe that adjusting the politics to science is exactly what we need to do. And we need to do it now. The Arctic is the alarm clock that of the world when it comes to climate change. This very week, we have very painfully been reminded by several new insights mentioned by Mr. Gyllenstierna. There are now places in Arctic with a temperature more than 20 degrees above normal. The recent ice loss in Greenland and the sea level that comes with that have caused the axis of the Earth to turn east. It's remarkable. One of the key conclusions in the Arctic Resilience Report is that the single most step to slow the pace of the Arctic change is to rapidly reduce the use of fossil fuel. So what do we do with this knowledge? Here in Sweden, we are determined to become one of the first fossil-free welfare states in the world. But I know that we are not alone in this. Recently, in Marrakesh, I strongly felt that there is a political momentum in the climate change politics. Hearing from brave mayors, brave business leaders, and brave leaders from the states, many states, saying that we have the map is clear, we're on the route, and we will continue on the climate route and facing the climate change together. As we all know, CO2 is not the only thing that is accelerating the warming in the Arctic. Black carbon, which is also known as soot, is another big challenge. Since snow and ice contribute by cooling the reflecting sunshine, warming increases when snow and ice disappear. And here, the Arctic plays a very important role. Our emissions of black carbon are more easily transported to areas with ice and snow. Since the last chairmanship of the Arctic Council, Sweden have pushed the Arctic Council to take action to reduce black carbon emissions. And at the Arctic Ministerial in 1915, countries agreed that we shall adopt an ambitious goal on black carbon by the next Arctic Ministerial to be held next year. And Sweden have been working very closely to the United States to ensure that the proposed common targets will be ambitious for real. Because this target will not only set the standard from the Arctic countries, but will play a role as an example for other countries and regions. We therefore very much hope that the US will continue working for an ambitious goal to be adopted at the next year's meeting. The warming that we see leads to disruptions in human activities. And these changes often affects the indigenous people first, because their livelihoods are very, very linked to nature. The warming also results in melting of the permafrost, which leaves buildings and roads without solid foundation, resulting in collapse. Slowing Arctic change and restore building resilience is crucial for the people in Arctic. And this new report gives us several new tools. And these tools increase our knowledge of what happens in the ecosystems in our societies when temperature rises. Resilience, as I try to understand it, is the ability of the system to bounce back and thrive during and after disturbances and shock. And this report points out what we can do within our society to strengthen our ability to act and to minimize the negative effect of climate change. And the case studies covers all the Arctic, from Kiruna to Nunavut. Finally, I would like to say something on the great threats of the Arctic, the environment. Protecting the marine environment is a very high protective priority for me. To achieve this, we must develop better political mechanisms. And the ability to establish marine protected areas in areas beyond the natural jurisdiction is a very important next step. And there are ongoing negotiations and an implemented agreement with the overall aim of protecting and preserving marine biodiversity in areas beyond the state's judiciary. This is a crucial process. Sweden have also actively engaged in the EU's initiative of a task force on marine cooperation. The goal here is to elaborate suggestions for enhanced marine regional cooperation within the Arctic Council. And it is important that this task force delivers a clear and strong recommendation to the foreign ministers in May on how the cooperation could be strengthened. Because today, the Arctic Council and the cooperation between the states in this region is more important than ever. And now, finally, I would like to extend my sincerest gratitude to everyone who has worked and been involved with the work of this report. And I would like especially to thank the US Department of Interior for their collaboration. Thank you.
Jättebra. Thank you so much for that, Carolina. We actually feel already after this presentation that it will be in good hands. So that's good. We will take this forward. How many people have been in the Arctic here, if I ask that question? It's quite a few. That's good. How many didn't know that they were in the Arctic when they were north of the polar circle, if they've been to Kiruna? Okay, so you see, you have been in the Arctic. We are saying this because it's a bit of a problem in Sweden, I think partly in the US as well, that we don't associate ourselves always as an Arctic country. But we do have important areas, clearly also in the Arctic in our own country. And if you have been there, you know that you get a sense of connection. My first field trip as a young researcher was to Franz Josef Land in what was then Soviet Arctic. And there was very obvious environmental challenges there, I can say. You didn't talk so much about climate change then in 1991. Interestingly enough, there were other things on the agenda. Someone who can actually really pinpoint and talk about the urgency of what is going on in the Arctic and connect it in an elegant way with other global changes and also connecting Arctic with the rest of the world is, of course, Professor Johan Rockström. Executive Director of the Stockholm Resilience Center. Johan Rockström, together with Joel Clement, maybe you can stand up, both of you, have been the two co-chairs. So you recognize each other here. So that's good to know, because Johan is, a few people know him in Sweden. Joel maybe not so famous in Sweden yet. So if you, during the coffee break, would like to speak to the co-chairs, Johan is one of them, Joel is the other one. But Johan, the floor is now yours for the urgency of the Arctic. Please, a warm applause.
Thank you so much, Johan. Let me just start on behalf of Joel and myself as co-chairs of the Arctic Resilience Assessment to congratulate us all for this phenomenal achievement, and thanks Caroline and the Swedish government for the support, and the US government for this really important science-based assessment of what resilience fundamentally is about. Just as Carolina says, the capacity of us as societies relying entirely on the Arctic biome and the ecological capacities to deal with surprise, stress and shocks, and avoid crossing tipping points and continue to develop in a positive way. And as Johan pointed out, there's an enormous urgency in recognizing that building resilience, and particularly the key conclusion in the Arctic Resilience Assessment, that working with social and ecological integration as a tool to build resilient communities is the fundamental pathway to have a possibility of a manageable and hopefully thriving future on planet Earth. And that is one of the key findings in this report, in fact, that the Arctic as a social ecological system with its 4 million inhabitants are an integrated part of the well-being of the world as a whole. That we are interdependent of a functioning Arctic, and at the same time the Arctic is a harbinger, a victim of the rapid, abrupt changes we're seeing in the world. And this report was presented by many of the colleagues in the Arctic Resilience Assessment work to Barack Obama at the White House Arctic Science Ministerial just a month back, reminding us that an average global warming of 2 degrees Celsius, which is not a goal, but the planetary limit set up in the Paris Agreement, actually translates to a 5 degrees Celsius average warming in the Arctic. And anyone, even climate skeptics, I would argue, agree that 5 degrees approaches a point of very, very shock-related livelihood conditions. And now we're seeing, just as Johan points out, a situation where we are actually having an abrupt, unprecedented, unpredictable from science, shock warming of 20 degrees Celsius warming in the Arctic, which actually is something that today must be a reminder for us that resilience is very likely the only chance we have if we're going to stand an opportunity of providing Arctic communities with an ability to deal with the surprising, shocking, and very stressful changes we're seeing in this large biome on planet Earth as we speak. Now, this is nothing that is isolated only for the Arctic. As we all know, we're starting to see the same kind of patterns on the other side of planet Earth, in Antarctica. I put this up because in our interim report that we released 2 years back, one of the key findings is actually that we should not see the Arctic communities, from the Sami reindeer herders to the Inuit fishing communities in Canada, as only victims of global environmental change. No, here we have a source of resilience. Here we have indigenous knowledge of an extraordinary history and value. I mean, it's very difficult to find communities that have been living for millennia under more stressful and challenging conditions than our communities and citizens in the Arctic. And that we have so much to learn in terms of how you build social-ecological resilience from our Arctic citizen fellowships. So this is something that has been incredibly valuable in the Arctic Resilience Assessment, to have indigenous community representatives throughout this work. Now, what we're seeing in the Arctic right now is a complex dynamics of multiple interacting factors, and that's why it's such a privilege to have AMAP as well as a core integrated project partner in the work we're doing in the Arctic assessment. This is just one reminder of that as far as science is today, despite the complexity, we cannot explain a 20 degrees Celsius shock in the Arctic as we speak unless we factor in average anthropogenic global warming of temperature rise in the atmosphere, unless we factor in the 95% absorption of heat in the world's oceans, which has led to surface waters being extraordinarily warm and affecting the Arctic from below. The extraordinary thin ice levels in the Arctic as we speak, which has then reinforced the fact that the jet stream is in a very wavy condition, all interacting, which may be explaining the fact that we are today at this very vulnerable state. You may have seen during the IUCN World Congress that some scientists translated, just as a back of the envelope exercise, that the 95% of heat that Earth has in its resilient state absorbed from our energy imbalance caused by our emission of greenhouse gases, that if you would release all of that in the atmosphere, if you would allow the heat which has been hidden under the carpet from our industrial development, it would translate to 36 degrees warming in the atmosphere. Now that is a shockwave to say the least, but it's also a bit of a reminder that 20 degrees Celsius in the Arctic, which may seem as a total, almost utopian, disastrous level, is actually in line with something that can happen given the dynamics we're talking about. You may have seen in the Arctic resilience analysis that what we're trying to do is to understand the developments and the driving forces occurring in the Arctic and how that combines with what we call regime shifts, when systems from lakes to wetlands to ice sheets have multiple stable states separated by thresholds, and that negative feedbacks, it's a very pedagogic word from science to call it negative. These are actually the feedbacks we love, the dampening feedbacks that keeps a system stable. Once we lose these negative feedbacks, such as, for example, the ability of ice to reflect back heat to space, a negative cooling feedback, when those shift over and you get a net positive feedback, a self-reinforcer, that's when you cross the threshold. That's what we call a regime shift, and they occur in social and ecological systems. Now, what we have on this graph is the last 20,000 years, when we've exited the last ice age. You see the average temperature on Earth being at -3 degrees Celsius. We enter the Holocene, this extraordinary stable phase from roughly 12,000 years back, the phase when we've developed civilizations on Earth. And then we see the pathway we've taken since the Industrial Revolution. And you see the IPCC RCP tracks where, as you know, the business as usual path we're following is a 4 degrees Celsius path by the end of this century. Then we lay on this the Paris decision, the legally binding aim to stay as far under 2 degrees as possible. A reminder that this is outside of the Holocene maximum range. The Holocene is a ±1 degree Celsius maximum variability. So it's already inevitably putting us in an adaptation and challenging, dealing with stress, resilience future. But then the key is to load on top of that the risk of regime shifts. And what you see here is in that left box, the Paris Agreement tipping points that we must now consider seriously having to face. The width of these columns here is the scientific uncertainty range. And what you see is, for example, that the world's coral reefs lie scientifically, as far as we know today, within Paris. Meaning, to put it simple, even if we deliver Paris, we are very likely to lose the world's coral reefs. But the drama here is on the alpine glaciers, the Arctic summer sea ice, and Greenland, which all lie within Paris. So despite uncertainty ranges, we see scientific evidence that we cannot exclude regime shifts in these systems. And what these regime shifts mean is that you have bifurcation points very early, that we can actually press biophysical on buttons very early, and that we then inevitably change feedbacks, which would then put us into a situation where we commit ourselves inevitably, for example, in the case of Greenland, to a 7-meter sea level rise, not tomorrow morning, but over the next centuries. And this is why it's so important to have precaution in our investments and developments in not least the Arctic. And that the Arctic is a harbinger and a regulator of the planetary scale resilience. That is why we place in the Arctic Resilience Assessment this integrated and interdependent positioning of the Arctic as a social ecological biome in the context of global sustainability. If I may, Carolina, say that your colleague Magdalena Andersson, for example, our Swedish finance minister, should be, in my mind, equally preoccupied by jobs and GDP in Sweden as by the stability of the Arctic, because it's all interwoven in the economic and social stability of any nation on planet Earth. We can no longer separate ourselves from either the Arctic, nor Antarctica, nor the Amazon rainforest, or the Baltic Sea for that matter. And that is the key finding also in the fundamentals of this assessment. Now, resilience is the understanding that things are, per definition, filled by nonlinearities, surprise, and shocks, and that it is a question of trying to stay within a desired equilibrium and continue to develop. Now, we define resilience in three different categories, or three different features that we consider when taking this fundamental starting point of resilience being the ability to deal with shocks and stress and continue to develop. And they include the following three. The first one is the classical fundamental one. How much stress and let's say, pressures can you take without moving out of your current state? The second one is how well are we set to adapt within a state where we're in? So how much abuse or stress can we take without crossing a tipping point? And we've put so much effort in the adaptation sphere, and that is important. But it is really recognizing that this is not about, if we are pushed too far away and need to take the final dimension of resilience, which is transforming in a situation of crisis. So resilience has these three features: the ability to avoid change and take stress and stay in a desired state, the ability to adapt when things are swinging within an equilibrium, and finally, if things go wrong, what's our ability to find new pathways of livelihoods and development. And this is important to recognize that therefore it is a tool to deal with a very changing conditions that we're seeing in the Arctic. We have done a mapping fundamentally in its core definition, which is how do we avoid tipping points? How do we avoid abrupt changes that go beyond what we can manage? And I'll jump this. And this is something that we find a very high relevance of doing in the Arctic. Obviously, we all feel that in this room because the Arctic is the place on Earth where we see the most rapid, abrupt changes occurring. The 2 degrees Celsius warming on planet Earth, meaning 5 in the Arctic, is a very strong representative of this. In the Arctic resilience assessment that we've done, we've therefore tried as best as we can to map what are the risks of regime shifts in the Arctic. And that has been done not only on climate change, but also on ecosystem change, on marine systems, on fisheries, on ecosystems across the entire across the entire Arctic circumpolar region. And we've done that through a number of case studies. And it's quite interesting to recognize today that we're sitting on a knowledge base which is circumpolar, where we're even able, and you won't see the colors here, but we're able to make a first assessment of where we see ecosystems and also communities that are able to maintain resilience. They're even able to increase resilience in situations of rapid change, but also systems that are losing resilience. So we're trying the first attempt to use a resilience assessment methodology to kind of rank social economic situations across the Arctic, which can be a tool for development among the Arctic nations. One way that this translates to, which is a way of using this, is that we're attempting to then list for the different Arctic nations across all the different regime shifts that we're mapping, from the risk of Greenland ice sheet collapse to kelp transitions to tundra shifts from boreal forest to desertified states. What nations are most subject to regime shift risks? And what you see here is, for example, that Canada, Russia, and parts of the US seems to be the Arctic nations subject to the largest, let's say, set of diverse regime shift risks. This is one way of trying to integrate Arctic Council knowledge into systems understanding of where are the different priority areas for development. So this means that we can actually, and that's one of the key findings here, that resilience is a useful framework to be able to develop and build societal, communal development in the Arctic region. Now, just to give you a few examples of one of the few of the case studies, this is an example of where resilience is actually surprisingly maintained among the Russian reindeer herders in the Yamal region. This is an area subject to gas exploration, subject to climate change, subject to massive challenges. But the findings here is that indigenous knowledge is maintained, they're not so affected by external organizations, and that there is a very strong indigenous capacity to handle the changing conditions, at least so far. On the other hand, we have the other contrast, which is the examples of cod fisheries collapse and herring fisheries collapse in Greenland and Iceland, where investments in quite monocultural industrial fishing industry has led to very important social disruptions because of collapse in the fisheries related probably to warming in the waters, which has shifted livelihood sources but not had, let's say, the social-ecological investments made to keep pace with that change. And then finally, an example which is quite interesting, which is which you probably run across, the Cape Dorset Inuit in Canada, showing the ability of indigenous communities shifting over and diversifying livelihood conditions, in this case to be really internationally renowned for arts, which is of course not a solution for all communities across the Arctic, but it's an interesting way of showing the red thread which we find in biophysical ecological research, that diversity is a way of building resilience. So fundamentally, resilience and transformation capacities are key to understand and navigate change across scales in the Arctic. In the Arctic assessment, we've also tried to understand how does the Arctic and communities in the Arctic link across scales in the world of change and in the planet of change. And obviously, the Arctic is fundamentally, as you see in the red arrows here, predominantly a victim of driving change, that there are massive pressures socially and ecologically occurring across the Arctic, and that this also needs to be understood in its complexity in the continued work we recommend for the Arctic Council. So resilience thinking offers a framework also for navigating the cross-scale dynamics in a rapidly changing world, and that this is a key finding also in how we can think of learning from the Arctic, but also seeing the Arctic as a priority for delivering, for example, on the Sustainable Development Goals. And that we believe that there is no such thing as an Arctic resilient future unless investments are made both in the Arctic, socially and ecologically, while at the same time delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. And that we need to frame these in a slightly more planetary adapted way, where we have four non-negotiable Sustainable Development Goals from an Arctic perspective: the freshwater, oceans, biodiversity, and the climate goal in particular, within which we could hope for socially and economically delivery on the Sustainable Development Goals, but that the Arctic is a strong signal, and that the communities in the Arctic are strong signals that there is no such thing as a future for the communities in the Arctic unless we actually take the entire Sustainable Development Goals agenda very, very seriously, and particularly transition to fossil fuel-free world economy, where Sweden is trying to show its leadership and be one of the first nations in the world. Thank you.
Tack. Ja, det var perfekt. Just take one question for you, Johan, because you've been part of working on this report for the last 5 years, and of course the resilience thinking was behind the whole idea. And I know when we started off the discussions with the Ministry for the Environment that we wanted to launch this, you really highlighted what you also said here, trying to apply the resilience thinking perspective on a region such as the Arctic. Do you think the report, has it managed to really demonstrate the strength of using the resilience framework thinking approach to describe and also analyze a region and the changes there, such as the Arctic? Do you think we have been successful in that regard?
Yeah, this is a question that should be shared with Chair Cornell, Annika.
And they will have a chance, but I want to hear you because you are the co-chair.
All my great colleagues in the steering committee for the Arctic Resilience Assessment. I think Martin Sommerkorn, you're here as well, Gary Peterson. Now, yes and no, to be honest, and I'll be very, very personally here to say that we have tested now for the first time at the large biome scale, applying an integrated resilience methodology and framework to be able to understand the challenges facing communities on the ground and to look at solutions for the future. And we have really come a long way in developing, let's say, the scaffolding for this. But to be honest, there's still much work remaining of how to apply this in full across such a large region. I mean, we're still at the case study level. We're still understanding that this is so complex and every local condition is very, very specific, and that there's so many parameters that integrate across scales, moreover. So I think this is the best resilience assessment ever done on planet Earth, but it's still a first step. towards something that the world needs much more. So the world needs to learn from us as well.
Great. Thanks a lot, Johan. Okay, we are going to, let's see now if I can try to be a technician at the same time. Normally that doesn't work at all. I barely know how this works. But anyway, we will move forward. We're going to have a panel now. But before I start that panel, Fredrik Hannes, we did actually acknowledge your important role when we started this whole process many, many years back. But you were not here then because you were probably doing something very important. Fredrik is now working at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs with our minister there on climate change, so I'm sure it was very important. But anyway, what I realized I didn't do, I just mentioned the names, but we didn't give them an applause at that point. These 4 names, Jeanette, Fredrik, Andres, and Marianne. I think let's do that as a, you know, applause is actually a way of also keeping awake, so it's a way of, you know, moving. I just wanted to mention also, I know we have a couple of younger people here, students from Loyola University. Can you raise your hands? From Chicago, great. And also, I think potentially also a few pupils, students from Norra Real over there. I want to highlight these 2 groups because, you know, as Johan said, this is the first step we have taken. The question is, though, if we fail to act on this, these are the guys who will have to take over and deal with whatever challenges we leave behind. So it's very important to have you here. But it's also very serious because what you're hearing here is actually your future. So, you know, put really hard questions to the panel we're going to have now. Start to think about them. In particular, the policy panel, because scientists, they all, you know, we just try to be nice and, you know, give you the challenges. But in the end, we have this policy panel, and, you know, what really should we try to get out of the policy discussion moving forward? Scientific panel, my favorite. Can I get the panelists up? You should know that you're on the panel, so please give them an applause so they feel welcome. So we have, from left, we have Marcus Carson, who is a senior research fellow at Stockholm Environment Institute. We have Sarah Cornell, who is a research coordinator at the Stockholm Resilience Center. We have Gary Peterson, who is the head of sustainability at Stockholm Resilience Center. And we have Annika Nilsson, who is also a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. These are representatives of a much broader group of people who really have contributed to the report. But you have been instrumental in this. And I should say, being sort of behind the stage, it has not been an easy process. Not even for the scientists, who normally always are good friends and never have any division, as you know. This has really been natural and social science coming together. This is one of the beauties of resilience, I think. You know, you really, really, really need to get different perspectives together in order to deliver something like this. And that should be painful. It should be painful, because if it isn't painful, we are not stretching the boundaries, we are not pushing things forward, we are not testing our ideas and challenging our thoughts. And you've done that for 5 years. Marcus, that's the same period more or less as Obama, and the same hair ending up, you know. So, you know, Obama getting gray from, you know, being a president of the US, and Marcus being gray after leading the Arctic resilience work. Anyway, Marcus, we have instructions to the panelists. They know they have approximately 7 speaking minutes each, and Marcus have divided up to begin and to end. And then I'm going to invite questions from you guys. I'm not going to ask questions myself. I have all the chance in the world to ask questions to these guys. I might ask one question. Then it's up to you, okay? Marcus, start.
My turn.
And speak close to the microphone, because it's a bit, yeah. Is it on, by the way?
Speak toward the audience as well, right? So I have to say it really is a pleasure to be launching this report at the end of a 5-year process. A little bit of a relief, as you want.
We should turn it on. There you go. Come on, scientists. Oh, to help them with every single step.
technologically. Now we have it, right? Shall I start over again? It is such a pleasure and a little bit of a relief to be launching this report at the end of a 5-year process. And part of the reason, as Yuan has already alluded to, and trying to hijack my thunder here, is the bridging process, that it's not just a matter of bridging these great distances in the Arctic, but also bridging between the different disciplinary training of the scientific disciplines, between different systems of knowledge, and also between science and policy, and ultimately, we hope, practice, to have the kind of impact that we hope that this report will have. So it's been a really challenging project in good ways. It's really forced us to think, it's forced us to negotiate, and I don't think it's possible to overemphasize how this sort of interdisciplinary work, not only between the sciences, but also between science and policy, really requires a lot of time and energy and negotiation to make sure that we're talking about the same things. And any of you who are married and have been in relationships know that this process of negotiating terms is a challenging one. And that's only with 2 people. So consider the challenges of diversity. If we can move to the next. Do I get this? Oh, this is perfect. There's a reason for picking this particular slide that I'll describe. Normally, the images we see of the Arctic are these iconic shots of huge expanses of snow-covered mountains, icebergs, sea ice. And this guy, or guys like these. But what this image really highlights is the core concept that this report is built around, and it's this sense of humans and nature, that we are utterly dependent on the ecosystems that provide our sustenance, provide our life support. And at the same time, whereas in this particular case, you could say that they're very dependent, and there are not enough people there to substantially impact their surroundings. But at a planetary level, the whole discussion about the Anthropocene means that there are now enough of us with our activities magnified sufficiently that we are a force in the opposite direction. And what that means ultimately is that as this interaction between social and ecological systems, or more accurately, parts of the same system, needs much, much more attention. And that is part of what the report has been focused on. I want to take just a quick moment to tour through a little bit of the history of this project, but I will make it fast. Johan's already mentioned it was a Swedish initiative during a chairmanship that lasted from 2011 to 2013. And unlike many initiatives, due to some quirks, we didn't have a co-chair in that. As we moved into the second phase and watched the United States begin to prepare for its own chairmanship, we could see a couple of things that were very important. One was that resilience would have a central role in that chairmanship. And the second, I think that's more subtle but equally important, is that the values underlying the chairmanship that the US was planning were very consistent with the values that guide Sweden in its engagement in the Arctic Council. So that made for a perfect fit. And we're very happy to say, after a number of discussions, negotiations, and some wondering whether it would actually happen, we sealed an agreement on a co-chairmanship. And that has really carried us to emphasize more the policy and ultimately the practice side. Will be ultimately very important with this. I also want to acknowledge people who Yuan didn't already name. There are several of you here who've contributed to the chapters or contributed in other ways, and I wonder if you could just take a moment and stand. I see a few. Stand up. Come on. Martin, Annika, Leanne. And there are a number of, I think there are a few being shy here, but these are people who contributed to the chapters and to the thinking behind this. And I would like to give a brief applaud to you guys. And the rest of you have already, because this report really represents the work of people spread across the Arctic and expertise that goes far beyond what's standing up here. Let me wrap up here pointing to this social ecological systems model and what's so important about this. In a lot of instances, science really homes in on one of these little phrases in here and seeks to understand it, but without fully grasping the interconnections between it. And I think the most important thing in the framing, this resilience social ecological systems framing with the report, is that we really seek to capture the connections between these. And in looking at the connections, we also identify the kinds of feedbacks that Yuan has referred to, the kinds of feedbacks that keep things stable, but also the feedbacks that we should be worried about that tend to accelerate changes that will be very disruptive. And those are the kinds of feedbacks to lead to what's often referred to nonlinear change, but it's the tipping points and cliffs that we talk about. Resilience is defined in lots of ways these days. It's exploded in its usage in just the last few years. And we actually apply some different meanings of resilience, but one of the things that's consistent throughout the report is we really highlight the importance of agency, of communities' capacity to come together, make decisions, and chart their way forward in a very uncertain world, and to do that with some effectiveness, using the knowledge that's available. And in each of the presentations you'll hear from my colleagues, you'll hear those elements reflected. So I'd like to pass this along to Sarah, who will take it up next.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to go that way, don't I? Here we are, technology. Some of us really, really should belong in a previous century. We're here today and we're really focused on the Arctic. But perhaps the most important message that I want to emphasize, this is really rather intimidating. Can I stand on tiptoes or something? The most important message that I want to emphasize is that the Arctic as a social ecological system looks really very different when you look at it from different perspectives. We can see the patterns and the dynamics of local systems pretty well when we're in them. As the report outlines a lot in several of the case studies. And obviously we're rather concerned about some of those systems right now in terms of the political interactions and dynamics that we see around the world. But a system at one level will affect and influence what is possible at the other levels in the scale too. So the challenge that we face is trying to understand the Arctic from these multiple scales at the same time, because we can only understand what happens at one level when we also understand the connections through to the others. I'm really not very good at this, okay. From a resilience perspective, one of the really interesting things about the connections across scales is that very often social activities are what link ecosystem processes across scales, and our biophysical ecosystem processes become the important links across the social systems. And so again, we have to understand the dynamics of both the social and the ecological systems as linked systems. This picture, you've sort of seen a little bit of it, Johan showed earlier as well. This connectivity of social and ecological across scales is both extremely well understood and extremely poorly understood. We've mentioned the polar amplification of global warming, for instance. We know about long-range transboundary pollution, and we mentioned black carbon and soot transport. We know about ecological range shifts, and one of the most amazing things as somebody fairly new to Arctic science was to realize just how much of our living nature uses the Arctic as part of migratory processes or, it is home to an immensely rich and diverse biodiversity that underpins the diversity of all the rest of life on Earth. So we have an understanding of these social, ecological, and physical dynamics. And I've sort of highlighted there 3 areas where these dynamics and these connections really matter, but where we also see disconnects because we look at things in their component parts. One is where we already know that the expansion of activity in the Arctic, of social economic activity in the Arctic, has knock-on effects everywhere else. Not everywhere else, but potentially everywhere else. We know that Arctic ecological protection is now a global concern as well, and it's become really clear in repeated studies of the Arctic Council and other biodiversity studies that our monitoring of ecosystem change is not adequate to understand the dynamics of change in the Arctic. We also know, and we've heard a lot about it already this afternoon, Arctic change triggers worldwide impacts, climatic impacts, and obviously the consequences of climate on all of our other systems. The really exciting thing in some ways is that Arctic actors have quite a lot of power to mitigate those risks. And so again, when we look at the whole connectedness and the cross-scale behavior, we can start to see points of intervention that we might not see if we only look at one level, at a community or one national interest or one particular context. Click and whir again. My role in this was really to look through what has already been done in the Arctic Council working groups. And so if there's any, I think maybe there's only a dozen people in the world who have read every single one of the Arctic Council working group reports. And it has been actually an immense pleasure. They are really, really valuable information resources. They have built knowledge communities, and they, as you read them, progressing through time since the Arctic Council was first formed, you can really start to see emerging best practice in a lot of areas, in transdisciplinary work, in this painful dialogue of learning and unlearning so that we build new language. We are starting to see a real emphasis on diversity and inclusion, and I would like to think that this Arctic Resilience Report starts to really make that the new normal for Arctic Council assessments. These new approaches for bringing knowledge together need to be nurtured and they need to be built up. One of the challenges is every time you make a structure to enable knowledge to be brought together, you create a new interface that needs also to be nurtured. And this takes me to my last point, that when you've got communities that are busy looking into these issues, they can't see the issues expressed in another one. And we see this a lot. I mean, I think the big priority now is in the bringing out of the new Arctic economic forums, and there are many of them emerging at the moment, that also need to read what's in the outputs of the biodiversity reports, for instance. So, when we've got all these different interests and different communities working together, we really must bear in mind that some are more powerful and some are more influential than others, and that the choices that are made in some area will have consequences somewhere else. And of course, we've already heard that sometimes we will find that conflicts are possible. We know about voices and networks and perspectives having these different influences. We know that we can't negotiate with environmental processes, but we can negotiate with the social process that determine those environmental processes. So we have shared opportunities, and those exist even though we have different worldviews. And again, one of the exciting things about being involved in the Resilience Report so far has been just to see some really very new approaches to dialogue that brings together business, government, communities, whatever scale those communities work at, and of course having science involved in that process too. Sorry, passing that button right on. That's the one. No. Yeah.
Over to you, Gary. The next presentation.
All right. So as Johan already mentioned, there are a wide variety of regime shifts that have the potential to occur in the Arctic. And let's see. So these aren't my slides. Okay. So sorry, these aren't the slides I gave to people, but I can just make up something. So there are a wide variety of regime shifts that occur in the Arctic, and many of these are special to the Arctic that involve ice and snow. That the transition between frozen and melted water causes uniquely Arctic processes. But many of these other types of Arctic tipping points are shared by other places around the world, like, say, coastal eutrophication. And so we at the SRC have done a lot of work on trying to identify and compare these regime shifts and see how they connect together in the Arctic. To give, what are regime shifts? Well, regime shifts are, they're popularly called tipping point, but the point is these changes are persistent, is they're difficult or often impossible to reverse, surprising, in that they're often even theoretically, they're in practice difficult to predict, but people have shown theoretically they can be impossible to predict due to the complexity and chaos of nature. And thirdly, that they have substantial impact on people and societies. And one example is where I talked about is this loss of Arctic sea ice. And to just give an example of how we've been thinking about them, you can think that there's various drivers of change in Arctic sea ice that can cause a shift from summer sea ice to open water. But this can then have an effect upon other processes. So here you have change in climate regulation, climate change, you also get acidification, but the effect of the loss of Greenland ice sheet can affect sea level and marine and terrestrial ecosystems by having the flow of nutrients into those systems. Similarly, with the loss of sea ice, you lose a substrate for biological productivity, and you also lose a mechanism which people and animals in the nature use to move around and connect each other together. So by losing sea ice, you fragment the Arctic socially and ecologically. By looking across all these things, what this picture is showing is that many different processes at local, regional, and international scales are driving these regime shifts in the Arctic. Many of these regime shifts share these drivers, and these affect many, many different of the benefits that people get from nature, these ecosystem services, and also the basic way the Earth system operates. And so 2 points that aren't totally clear here, but to point out is that climate change is a dominating driver that affects almost everything, and that many cultural things are affected by these regime shifts. This isn't just the removal of ice affects some caribou. This affects the variability of people to live and who they are in this landscape in really quite profound ways, because they don't just change the species, it changes the very shape of the landscape and how you can move around in it. And then finally, as Johan said, these events can cascade out from the Arctic, and they can do this in 2 ways. One, they can just change the climate elsewhere, but they can also trigger cascading change in other systems. All these other tipping points around the world of seagrass and coral reefs can be affected by this climate turbulence, producing more surprising change. And despite knowing a bunch about the Arctic and being pretty up to date on Arctic climate change models, I was actually a bit surprised reviewing this of how much uncertainty there is and what's not included in climate change models. Climate change models are pretty weak on the Arctic, and they're not very good at dealing with changes in vegetation, especially how the vegetation affects flows of moisture. A lot of these regime shifts are going to change these processes and produce surprising consequences for climate change. So we can't say what those are, but I think we can very firmly say that compared to a few years ago, we think that climate change will be much more surprising in the Northern Hemisphere over years and decades. Sorry, the other thing we did is looking at not just the ecological resilience, but the social-ecological resilience. And as Johan said, the Arctic is really a huge example of people's ability to adapt, transform, and be resilient in very, very harsh conditions. And we looked at what seemed to explain patterns we saw if people had identified resilience, transformation, and the loss of resilience. And I wish I had my slides here to show you. What we really found was that self-organization was a key factor explaining the ability of people to maintain or transform. And in particular, it's the loss of self-organization that was consistent across all the cases of loss of resilience. And so why have these people lost this ability to self-organize? Well, it's basically because of the Arctic nation countries who colonized the Arctic and removed the ability of people to organize themselves. So I think this is one of the messages I think we would have from there. There's many processes which you can use to build resilience, but one of the things Arctic nations could do is stop doing the things that are destroying people's resilience. And there's a lot of potential to learn about what is building transformation and building these social-ecological capacities to cope and adapt and respond to change that can be done further, because this is something where the fragmentation in these silos that Sarah talked about blocks this integrated social-ecological understanding at the big level. Our case studies are all based on the few places where there's been long-term social-ecological research. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Gary, and also thank you for being adaptive.
Yeah. I just made up that talk.
Yeah, exactly. Strong adaptive capacity. Sorry about that. But it was excellent, really nice. Annika Nilsson, please. And speak very close to the microphone because the sound is not the best.
I will be very close to the mic. Does
Thank
this
you.
work? Well, I'm now going to move into the social and political sphere because the chapters I've been responsible for are really about how do we shape change, deliberately shape change in society, and they're about governance. When I started work on this 5.5 years ago, the question was, what is resilience? How do I explain resilience? How do I translate it? This time around is what's governance? How do I deal with it? How do I translate it? And I think we're still struggling with it. So I'm going to spend a little time seeing how I view governance. Here's a picture of a social-ecological system. And to me, governance is the kind of myriad of places where we negotiate our relationship both with each other and with our environment around us. That's where we negotiate what we value in our environment, but we also negotiate what behaviors are acceptable and which behaviors we want to promote. So governance is kind of a pivot point, creating our relationship with the environment. We had this really broad mandate, but we decided we wanted to focus on the circumpolar governance, otherwise we could be lost in a myriad of various governance mechanisms across the Arctic. So we focused on the circumpolar, and one of the things that's really clear is that the landscape within which Arctic Council work is really dynamic and changing. To the left here, I decided very deliberately to not take the polar projection image. I took the more common global image because we have all these new actors in the Arctic who want to be part of defining what the goals of governance in the Arctic are. We have the new observers in the Arctic Council, but also many other actors that aren't formal observers. At the same time, we also see a movement towards more regional self-governance, often indigenous self-governance like the Greenland self-government, Nunavut, the Finnmark Act. So there's a kind of a diversification, and we also see now, just last year, the regions, the subnational regions becoming active. Norrbotten got its own Arctic strategy just recently. So there's a movement that needs to be navigated. And so what role should then the Arctic Council have in this landscape? We've had the Arctic Council structure with the working groups from before. We have seen this picture of the activities of the assessments report. But now we have all these other things too. We have the global agreements that we have to relate to, like the Law of the Seas, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and a bunch of other ones. World Trade Organization, NATO, all kinds of organizations that are there. And then all these new Arctic ones, the Arctic Circle or Arctic Circus as some people call it. It's not a formal organization. We have the Arctic Economic Council. They all have different kinds of flavors, but the Arctic Council needs to kind of find its specific role in this space. And that's not going to be easy, but I think an awareness of that changing space is critical for the Arctic Council to be able to play a role in resilience. And I went back to the previous report, and one of the key findings there talks about that you have to be responsive and flexible. And I think that's also true for the Arctic Council. And we try to ask ourselves, what capacity then does the Arctic Council have to take care of all these new signals that are coming in, this new landscape? And we used a framework of learning where you can learn to become more effective at what you're already doing. You can start changing a little bit, but you can also really reframe to think in a completely new manner. So my question was, has the Arctic Council been able to anytime rethink, to think in a really new manner, given the new challenges coming in? So we did 3 case studies. We looked at persistent organic pollutants, we looked at climate change, and we looked at extractive industries. And I would say when it comes to persistent organic pollutants, the Arctic Council has been extremely successful. Not only has it been able to feed scientific information directly into international agreement and continues to do so, it has also, which is not visible here, created a new working group to take care of pollution in the Arctic. cleaning up old sources of pollution, which was not at all part of the initial framing when the Arctic Council set out to do this work, because then it was all transboundary. Climate change, a little bit more mixed picture. It was excluded from the agenda to start with, because that was supposed to be the global issue. Then we got the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, and for various reasons it was difficult to follow up on. Eventually we got the SWEPA, the Snow, Water, Ice and basically cryosphere assessment. And now we have the ongoing adaptation actions for a changing Arctic, but it has not been easy. What's interesting to see now the last year, you get initiatives such as the US initiative, Obama's initiative at the Glacier Conference, which was formerly not an Arctic Council activity. So where does the Arctic Council going to do here? We heard about the soot stuff, where the Arctic Council is doing stuff, but that's really just a small part of the emissions that affect climate change in the Arctic. So there's a challenge. Then we looked at extractive industries, and there it's even more challenging. We have hydrocarbon. We had a big assessment on oil and gas, and there we actually have, as one result of that, an agreement of preventing oil pollution, which is signed there at the Kiruna Ministerial. Mining, nada. There is nothing. So that's an area, that's something that really affects sustainable development in the Arctic. So I'll leave it at that. And I want to highlight this from chapter 7, a bundle of interlinked resources, I call this. These are the resources that are much more important than any minerals or any oil and gas in the Arctic. These are the resources that would create capacities for us as a society to handle change, to navigate surprises. And we also look here at what the Arctic Council has done and can do in relation to these various aspects of adaptive and transformative capacity. For some issues, the Arctic Council, the Circumpolar Cooperation, has a natural fit. For other ones, it might be more a national interest or a national responsibility or a local responsibility. I won't go into the detail of that, but putting that picture, because this is what we need to strengthen. These resources we need to secure. And here's just a summary of the different chapters that you can read for yourself. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think that was really 4 extraordinary presentations, with or without the correct slides. But it was really great, and I think it captured a lot that we have in the report. Of course, it's a very comprehensive report. There are a lot of stuff in there. Interesting, and not least, to also pointing towards policy. And Marcus, I know you want to say a few words to sort of conclude this part before I actually invite the audience. So keep it short, yes, because I would like really to get the audience to have a chance to ask you questions here.
So I will keep this short, but the big question is, where do we take this? How do we bridge from science to policy to action? And there are a couple of messages, I think, that come out of this with this social ecological system resilience perspective. One is that there are already a wide range of activities underway in the Arctic that build resilience in a variety of different ways. So we don't have to start with a blank drawing board. We don't have to go back and ask designers to come up with something completely new and untested. And what we do know is that these activities can be expanded in a variety of ways. They can be multiplied, so that you do something roughly similar in many different places. They can be scaled up, so that you do it from a higher scale to reach further. And they can be pieced together so that the gaps that exist can be filled. And we see a number of specific examples, but these speak to some of the more general categories. We need to expand monitoring of social ecological systems. And there is monitoring going on in the Arctic, but this is an example of where the puzzle pieces come together. Some very interesting and important work being done, but we need to link the systems so that we're monitoring both sides at the same time. And it's especially difficult under current conditions to monitor social developments in the Arctic. The second is there's a lot of work now going on, not least within the working groups, to bridge these knowledge gaps. We know a lot about what sits within the silos, but we need to start much more systematically building between them, or even for a while get rid of the silos. And the important aspect of this resilience approach is that it starts from a linked perspective. And the third, the point that Gary raised about self-organization or capacity for self-organization. We also talk about this in terms of governance, in terms of fate control. These people exercising their capacity to steer themselves into the future. And this is something that takes practice. People are better at it when they do it a lot. We also see some good examples of people engaged in planning for their local energy needs, in addressing local challenges and problems, and where they engage in those things effectively, it tends to reinforce that capacity. So as we come to the final product of this report, where we're talking about a synthesis that includes recommendations, we'll be looking at those specific kinds of examples to recommend expansion of things that are currently effective. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. And this is, as you mentioned now in the end, a next step will be this synthesis for Arctic leader, or whatever we may call it in the end. And of course, you know, when you talk about breaching science and policy, you're getting out in areas that we are common, both organizations working quite a lot with. But it gets nervous as well, just in terms of choosing words. So you say should, would, could, may, consider. Can go on forever. So we're going to have an exciting process there, how we will make sure that whatever we have been finding out in this report, the conclusions from the report, how can that be policy relevant, you could say. And then that's how IPCC frame their recommendations. They are policy relevant. By the way, we have a microphone there. We have a lot of people here interested in these issues. You can now ask questions, but you have to have the microphone. And these are questions then for the science panel. So if they find questions to be difficult, they will defer them to the policy panel. So of course, in the other end of the room, can you raise your hands when you have questions? I have a feeling where we have questions. Keep them short. You can also make a short comment if you want to, and introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Olaf Linden. I work with the International Maritime Organization. I wonder to what extent shipping has been part of this review. I mean, shipping tends to be out, not under the radar of normal sort of processes or negotiations. They sail by themselves, and suddenly we have, I mean, the plans. I know the plans in the industry is for the Arctic route, the northwest and the northeast passage. Very much so. In a few years, we may have hundreds of ships every summer sailing the northwest and the northeast passage.
Okay, it's a good question. Can you cope by taking 2 or 3 comments and then?
Yes.
Is that okay? So keep track of this, please. There's one here in the middle and then one in the back. So there are now a diagonal like that. So 1, 2, 3.
My name is Svetlana Gross. I work with the Swedish Energy Agency, and the question mostly to Annika related to governance and the extractive industries. A lot of Arctic countries have been putting a lot of hopes towards the oil extraction, and Norway is still opening new fields in the Arctic, and I know that Greenland has been drilling for sort of prospecting for oil, thankfully unsuccessfully. And as you said, there is a lot of different types of governance structures and governments around the polar circle. You have Russia, you have Norway, you have Greenland, you have the US, Canada, different types. Have you found any evidence? Have you found any evidence of the relationship of sort of the governance structure and how willing they are to drill or not to drill? Thank you.
Okay, good. It's easier to say stop drilling when you don't have oil. That's true. In the middle and then in the back.
Yes, my name is Tom Arnbom, work at WWF. I wonder if you could elaborate how you managed to get, or how you get the traditional knowledge into the report, because there are 40 groups, at least 40 groups of indigenous people living up here.
It's a very good point. Thank you. And then in the back, we take the final one and then I'll let you come in.
Thank you. Gosia Śmieszek, Arctic Center, University of Lapland. I have a question regarding observing and monitoring that, Markus, I think you had in your last comment. So I wanted to ask, especially when it comes to, like, for monitoring, we actually usually need benchmarks. So especially when it comes to monitoring of social systems and even more combined social ecological systems, where are we now, and how do you assess the situation?
Excellent. Thank you very much. So 4 very interesting questions. They are partly linked, I must say. It's a lot about governance and how we have ensured also indigenous people in this. Annika, you had also a direct question to you, and then I'll let the others come in.
So I will start with the oil and gas governance. What the Arctic Council has done is, I would say, is the oil pollution prevention agreement, focusing on something where circumpolar cooperation is especially relevant. But I think it also illustrates one of the dilemmas of the Arctic Council in that areas in which there is very strong national interest, such as energy resources and fisheries for that matter, or hard security issues, the Arctic Council tends to stay away from. And I don't think we can expect that the Arctic Council would be the body that will govern those kinds of resources, because they're just simply too strong. But it might look them for the areas where everyone benefits from the cooperation. That's my guess is where we will see, and we might hear something different from the policy panel. We have representatives of countries that have some interest in in that. When it comes to shipping, we didn't look at it specifically here, but the Arctic Council has, of course, done in its working group that's called PAIN, Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment, and the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment was a follow-up to the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. And that actually is one of the areas where the Arctic Council actually systematically follows up on its recommendations, one of the only areas where it systematically follows up on its recommendations. And one of them, I think, is the implementation of the Polar Code in the IMO. So it's we didn't focus on it here, but it's certainly on the Arctic Council agenda.
Okay, so please, Sarah.
I'll come in straight on that on the shipping thing too. Shipping and the associated infrastructure features a little bit in some of the case studies that we talked about, and obviously as one of the major drivers of physical change in the Arctic, and also it's a feedback in its own right too, a response to very rapidly changing drivers. We had some really interesting dialogue processes where people involved in shipping spoke with us as well. One was at a workshop in Washington, D.C. in June last year, and another was a roundtable discussion with shipping people and IMO people and engineering organizations as well at London International Shipping Week in the autumn last year. And for me, one of the really interesting things is the outcome of that meeting. It's not fully documented, although some of the input from that came into one of the chapters in the Arctic Resilience Report. One of the outcomes of that shipping discussion is that they want to host a similar one at the International Shipping Week in Singapore next year. So again, that's an indication of the real rapid expansion of the Arctic. I want to pick up very briefly also on the observation and monitoring, and I think that there's some I'm very happy to point to the text boxes where we mention that. We have sort of gathered some information on the initiatives that are taking place, really on networks of networks for observations, and again, how we build up a more consolidated picture. One of the things we've highlighted too is some really interesting work trying to a circumpolar network of observations of cultural heritage as landscapes and icescapes melt. Some of the sort of long-term repositories of past social systems are really highly at risk. And so again, we're sort of looking at how we can make sure that we capture some of these lessons from history as well as contemporary observation as well. So I'd be really happy to talk with that.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, Gary?
Yeah, so just to mention about the indigenous knowledge. So I think the case studies we did were one of the ways in that came in most in a very integrated way. And so in terms of the terms of reference, the time, the funding of this report, it wasn't a co-produced report. And I think this is something that's a general challenge to go beyond local collaboration to really including indigenous knowledge in larger assessments. I work a lot on the IPES global process looking at biodiversity and ecosystem service, which also has a similar mandate. It's a big challenge. So what we did is our case studies were selected to be diverse, addressing a bunch of different issues around the Arctic, but they're all places where there's been long-term place-based research. And so depending where those are, there are people who would be variously considered indigenous or aboriginal or not. but they are all involved in some of that research is co-produced. And during the process of the Arctic Resilience Assessment, we certainly had Indigenous representatives involved in the process as well as is normal for the Arctic Council.
But if I can even add there, because I think it's an interesting point. We started off very early with a large or a very, very interesting workshop in Kautokeino, which gave us a lot of insights into the work of the ARR. But I also had a chance now towards the end to speak to some of the representatives from the Indigenous people. They clearly also said what you're saying, Gary. I mean, they did expect to be more involved, and there is a question of resources, to be honest, from both sides there. So we cannot just expect involvement free of charge, if we say that. I mean, they need resources to be able to be involved, just like anyone else. And I think sometimes we have an expectations that they should just contribute. So it's an important point to bring with us when we move forward, to be honest. This is one of the lessons learned, I think. Marcus, maybe one or two words also about monitoring of social systems and so on. I mean, this came up.
Yeah, this is especially interesting because there's been quite expansive work done to determine what are the most useful indicators of social well-being in the Arctic, and those have been anchored to readily available information. One of the characteristics of the Arctic is that information is slow to get, and it tends to be fairly sparse. So to keep a very clear sense of well-being in the Arctic is a real challenge. There's an additional challenge, and that is that in many instances, livelihoods are much more tightly coupled with nature than in many other places in the world. And that means that the standard measurements that we use for knowledge, and in the case of the Arctic social indicators work, the proxy is years of school completed, or economic well-being, which the proxy used as household income, or fate control, where the proxy used as legal rights. But in each of those cases, there's a huge area that's not really measured, and we're not very good at knowing how to measure it. So where we talk about school knowledge, we measure the number of years of school. There are also rites of passage and other ways to assess the status of traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge, but those haven't been very well developed. And our argument is that the diversity in these kinds of knowledge actually helps to build resilience, and is very important. People who, whether you're indigenous or not, in the Arctic, there's quite a connection with nature in that people's livelihoods are more closely coupled. There are hunting clubs in northern Sweden where people put a lot of meat in the freezer and enjoy the contact with nature that doesn't show up in household income. That's even more the case in many instances where indigenous communities depend on food that's hunted or gathered or fished from nature. And there are ways to measure some of that, but they're not nearly as routinized. And then the same goes for this capacity for self-organization. We can look at legal rights, but to make use of those, there has to be a capacity on the ground for people to be able to work together. And in some communities, that's very, very strong and a key source of resilience. We saw that in our case studies. And in others, it's not. And we can analyze what those factors are, but we need to develop some new ways of gathering that information, and certainly ways of assessing that. And that'll be a challenge going forward.
Okay. Annika, you had a very short before we take next set of questions.
Yeah, I think actually if one takes that bundle of resources that I talked about, and what we ultimately would like to know is what that bundle of resources looks like, but also have enough information for policymakers to use that to judge their decisions. Okay, if we decide this and that, will that decrease or increase that bundle of resources that we have available? So you have something to actually make sure we don't erode resilience, that we actually strengthen it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We have a couple of more questions. 1, 2, 3 I've noticed. So please.
Thank you. My name is René Söderman. I work as Senior Advisor for Arctic Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland. I know you are going to ask questions from us. I will be in the policy panel afterwards, but I want to throw it back to you now. Sustainable development and the UN Sustainable Development Goals are often mentioned in the same context as resilience. And we heard also about how governance is diversified in Arctic issues. My question is quite simple. With these UN sustainable goals, we have all united behind them in the UN, all the member countries. Is it possible to address these resilience challenges through the lens of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and try to strengthen the resilience of the Arctic through them, through the goals and through the targets that there are? The UN Sustainable Goals, there are 17, everybody of us know that already, but there are at least 4 goals which you mentioned resilience directly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had one there and one there. Yes, so first.
Someone show.
There. Yes.
Number 3.
Thank you. Björn Dahlbäck, Swedish Polar Research Secretariat. I think, a question where your answers might be fed into the panel after Fika. In very, very concrete terms, now please be very concrete. What are your worries? The obstacles for the continued process. I really acknowledge that writing this and working with this has been a process that has delivered things, and now you have a document. And at the end of the day, or when we leave here, what really worries you that will not happen or will happen?
Exact. That's great. That's very good. So actually, this was, well, we've been moderating together, you and I, too many times. This was, was going to be one of my final questions. And exactly, you have a chance to feed into the policy panel based on your scientific insight. What really are the obstacles? What do you expect now? So that's really great. Thanks a lot, Björn. Please.
Thank you. Martin Smokor, I work for WWF's Arctic program.
Okay.
I think I would like us to actually hone in on the very special thing that this is. We are also in the discussion honing in on very interesting topics that are close to our heart. While I think the unique thing of this is that we have an attempt to look at a region through a systems lens. I don't think that has been done before. Taking a systems approach and looking what percolates from taking it is probably the maximum thing that this report can achieve. And so I have a question to the 4 panelists, actually. We have taken a resilience approach to work, to operate this systems approach to the Arctic. My question is, how has the systems approach itself grown over the last 5 years? What did we know? Do we know today about taking a resilience approach for a region that we didn't know 5 years ago? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we actually we have received a question also from our web audience, and it's the classical question of why it is difficult to get even people to act on climate change. One of the Ds that Espen Stocknes quite often talk about, distance. So the Arctic tends to be distant still, and we tend to show polar bears. And they are far away for many of us. So if we are going to convince countries outside of the Arctic, and the question mentions, for instance, Central Europe, the big countries in Central Europe and so on, many of them are observers, but still, if we're going to convince them to care about the Arctic and people there to care about the Arctic, what kind of messages can we send that they can understand directly? Not just, we are interconnected, but anyway. So we have the SDGs. Is that a good framework? Can that bring us an opportunity as well? We have the key obstacles to move forward. The question about the systems approach and distance, and you have 2 minutes each. Daily life of a politician. 2 minutes each to give your perspective of that. Annika, you are eager. You're an old journalist. You know how to do it.
I can start with the SDGs. Actually, in a project we're starting right now, resource extraction and sustainable Arctic communities, I'm looking at how the SDGs map onto the different aspects of adaptive and transformative capacity. You will see that many of them are actually the same, and I think it's quite interesting. Resilience is not a goal in and of itself. It's human well-being. That's the goal. Resilience is a way to ensure human well-being. So I think matching those is a work that needs to be done. And I want to connect that to the question of worries and hopes of what we want to do. I think many of the issues that we need to take on now are politically controversial. Some will be able to work further into the political system, but quite a bit of work also needs to be done as research, independent of the political system, moving that knowledge base forward. And there I think actually, to answer Martin, that the work we have started now, that some of the conceptual work, especially, and for me, I think placing governance in this broader context has become quite important. So there are different kind of conceptual models I have now than I had when I started, and hopefully in dialogues with all other colleagues, I have many of them here from different aspects of my research life, we can see how that can grow further.
Thank you very much. And it's an interesting point in a way, how much do you compromise as a scientist in order to be able to communicate with policymakers? Because just, you know, there are certain no-nos sometimes. And we've been struggling with this in ARR, but I think we've been quite bold. Not all the way, maybe, but still. Sarah, you want to?
Actually, Annika said almost exactly what I wanted to say about the Sustainable Development Goals question. One thing that I'm slowly coming to realize is that 17 goals and 169 targets are all necessary but not sufficient. And so I really liked the way that she emphasized the big goal. And actually, I always take us back to the wonderful Brundtland Commission's definition about not just human well-being, but harmony between humans and nature. And that's very much a social ecological framing. And I think absolutely that a resilience frame should be fully compatible with making sure that we maintain that and tick off all 169 targets and however many indicators there are as well. I'm going to come to the worries question because it also feeds into all the rest as well. My biggest worry is quite simply that people don't read. So this phenomenal amount of thinking and working will sit there. And I really encourage you to, I mean, it's wonderful, it's nicely illustrated, so start with the pictures, start with the big headings and the big print, and get caught up in actually what is a really rich, well-argued, well-thought-through, well, some of it is a real pleasure to read.
Brilliant. It's brilliant.
And the reason I know that people don't read is partly because the Arctic Council has regular statistics on downloads, and I have downloaded every one of the Arctic Council reports, so I know how many people have read them, or at least downloaded them. And the other thing I did just for fun one day was count up how many contributing authors there were, or lead authors there were. There are about 2,000 authors of the whole suite of Arctic, roughly, big handfuls reports, of which only about 100 are cross-linkers. People who have read the reports of the other working group. And that for me is, I mean, obviously we have to work with art. And so those are kind of little snippets of one of the worries that I have, that we keep working with ignorance even though there is knowledge. Which takes us a little bit to the lessons of systems in practice. I think the one thing that I know now that I knew in theory before, but really know now, is this importance of connections. And the connections can be serendipitous, and again, the connections that happen in the world of ideas are vitally important. And linked to that, the sort of dynamic connectedness means that we aren't dealing with machines. I really would want to emphasize that systems, especially social systems and ecological systems and the whole thing together, they aren't tweakable machines in the way that we often talk about them. And that in turn leads to the distance question. One really interesting thing in the Arctic Council declarations, if you read them one after the other, is that they all start with the sort of the Arctic up there and out there. And the latest ones are very much incredibly interventionist. You know, kind of countries know that the Arctic is theirs now. And you see that in the Arctic strategies of the new member countries and the new observer countries, with countries like India arguing very well that the Arctic belongs to them as well because it affects their monsoons. And obviously that sort of is a very new shift on geopolitical understandings too.
That's good. So actually that is in a way a positive development, talking about the questions from the web. They start to see and understand the connection, which makes it much closer. You connect. Good. Gary?
Yeah. So maybe just going, I think I have two worries, and one is that the world not stopping climate change. I think it's really the challenge, as Johan mentioned, that we need to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions, and all of these regime shifts are going to, the risk of them are going to keep increasing as long as we keep emitting CO2 to the atmosphere. and without stopping it. And it's a huge disproportionality. However, if you look at this and you say like, well, how much of this is from the Arctic Council countries? Cumulative emissions are about a bit less than 50%. But if you include these observer countries, also China, India, who have this stake in the Arctic, then it gets up to about 80, 98%. So saying that you are destroying what you care about is a connection. The other thing to mention is I think that I'm worried about is a lack of reconciliation with Indigenous people in the Arctic. The population of Indigenous people in the Arctic is actually growing quite rapidly, and there's lots of opportunities for the world to benefit from their knowledge, and actually this the diversity that their use of the world can add. But this is something that is really maybe not being done as much as it could be. And this means lots of people have far worse lives, and the world is far worse than it needs to be. So just to end with the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a shame that Johan sneaked out, because Johan Rockström and our colleagues have been doing a lot of stuff of trying to link resilience and the Sustainable Development Goals, as these guys mentioned as well, is that they're very consistent, but I think it's really the issue also what SEI people are doing, is you really don't want to be trying to turn up one of these sustainability goals without thinking about the others. We need to take an integrated approach, and that's also that human society requires the biosphere, and we need to transform from being users of the biosphere and being less bad in how we treat the biosphere to being stewards and looking after our home. And the same way as like for the business people and the economics, that depends upon society as well as the biosphere. We need to look after society rather than mine it or erode it. And there's, in our report, there's lots of examples in the Arctic of places that had experienced the same kind of shocks. So say like in Iceland, 2 places both had fisheries collapse. But one of them, which had more diversity in its fishing fleet, was able to quickly adapt and transform to doing whale tourism because they still had small boats they started taking people out on, successful. The other one, which had big investments in fish processing plants, had all this locked in capital. And it was very hard to change what they were doing. So you can see these examples. And in a positive way too, Kiruna in Sweden is another example where by our metrics, Kiruna should be a case based compared to other places that doesn't have resilience. But because the Swedish government has put in huge investment into Kiruna and really engaged also with the residents of Kiruna, which doesn't usually happen with Indigenous people in, say, the US who are wanting to relocate, it's been able to be resilient. And so you can see these in our indexes, these kind of patterns, and you can kind of see a bit more how you can build resilience in the Arctic rather than undermining it. So I think there's a lot of hope that we can move forward to being more stewards of the Arctic, and the Arctic can lead the way in that because, as the very first talk mentioned, it's a bit somewhere that's experiencing earlier than everywhere else these extreme impacts. But the people there are actually much more resilient and adaptive and have all this experience that we could use for other places if we work with them. So
excellent. Thank you very much. Learning from the region, really. And Marcus, the final 2 minutes.
Yeah, actually, if I could repeat what Gary just said, I would do that.
That's a classical example.
That was really on the mark. But since I can't, I'm going to add a couple of other things. One, Sarah emphasized reading and how this is really worth reading. But I want to emphasize that it's worth reading because of the work that many people have done, but it's readable because of the work that our editors have done. And they, and you hear the laughter up here, so you get the point. There's some serious intervention that's been done to make this accessible. And we may not have achieved that 100%, but I can tell you that Tom and Marion, who are our main editors in this process, have made this into something that you all could actually engage in over the holidays and feel like, wow, that was pretty good. That was pretty okay. So there's a thank you that needs not to be left behind. On Martin's point about a systems approach, I think this is a little bit of a worry because like relationships, systems approach takes a lot of bridging that we don't know how to value or measure. So we talk a lot about the need for social sciences and climate, understanding, and about the need to bridge disciplinary boundaries. But we still don't know very well how you do that. And part of the way that you do that is by locking yourselves in a room or a project together and working it out because you're committed to the same goal. And Martin and I have had a little bit of experience with that too, but you really get to some good places when you put in that energy. But the system for financing and for evaluating doesn't really know how to give credit for that kind of effort. That's a worry, but that we're pretty stubborn is, I think, encouraging. And then let me end on this point about how to make it relevant, because part of the reason that the title was why does it matter is it really is an effort to make it relevant. There's a saying that's, I think, is way overused, that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So I wouldn't say it without saying that it's overused, but what we send up there is coming back to us. It may come in the form of changed monsoon or other kinds of weather patterns, but we know how connected this is, and we'll begin to see more of the tangible results, or things that at least would be expected. So I think the warning bells that are being rung with changes that we're seeing now, not least this most recent one with a 20 degree above normal, or last Christmas when Chicago was actually colder than the Arctic, those kinds of things will likely happen more frequently, and they move us closer to the thresholds that Gary emphasized, where we don't know where they are until they're behind us. But that kind of relevance, I think, to pay a little bit more attention, not only to what's happening there, but how it may be feeding back, and to what we can do, as again that Gary points out, that we can stop doing the stuff that's sending problems that way that are likely to be amplified and sent back to us. And that's a really important place to start.
Great, thank you very much, Marcus. I know I'm a bit maybe biased and not completely, objective here and not behaving very scientifically, but I personally must say I think that the group of scientists represented also by the four of you here, you've done an extraordinary job. I really must say, and I also appreciate, Marcus, very much that you highlighted the fact that there are other competences also really helping to make this report what it is, that are equally important to make the report readable, for instance. So really fantastic, both colleagues from the Stockholm Resilience Center, what you have done and contributed, and my own colleagues from the Stockholm Environment Institute. So a warm applaud really to you. So we are in Sweden, which means that we drink coffee and eat small little things called buns. And you can have one of them, and towards the end, if there are anyone left, you can have two. So after that, we will have the policy panel. This will be introduced by our colleague Joel Clement from the Department of Interior in the US, and he will also mention and present shortly something called the Arctic Resilient Action Framework, which is actually a policy response really coming from this already. Quite exciting, so I recommend you to be here. We will have the minister back. This is unique, Carolina, a minister staying for the entire seminar. An applaud by itself, But I should give you the secret. We thought, how do we get her to stay? Well, if we put her as the opening speaker and in the final panel, she can't sneak out. Isn't it? I'm transparent always. And after this, later on, we will also have some mingle. So stay on. 3:10, we will meet again.
Okay.
Hallå? Hallå? Hallå, hallå?
Ett, två.
Det är den här, Petri. Det är den här som inte låter.
En, två, tre, fyra, fem. Den låter dålig, ja.
Ett, två.
Ja, men den här är ju på maxvolym. Alltså den är ju på max.
Hallå? Hallå? Hej? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Vet du hur vi får göra för någonting? Att den som pratar i den här, jag säger det till henne. Den här får man hålla lite närmare så här. För istället för att ha stativet där, kanske kan hålla i den så här. Nu hörs det jättebra. Alternativ att vi ställer den här. Jag vet ju inte hur lång är människan som står. Ja, men nu kommer det andra med.
Alltså att man tar av den då?
Ja, man kan ta av den. Och i så fall prata så här.
Det här, man håller så här och pratar. Och pratar så här. Och då hörs det väldigt tydligt.
Ska demonstrera då?
Ja, du får visa. Nu gör vi så här.
Jag vet inte folk som tycker om att prata, sen gestikulerar så har de mikrofonen så här. Ja, precis. Då är det det är därför man ju ser att man ska ha här och prata här.
Jag är inte van vid mikrofonen heller. De som är vana, de lutar den lite tillbaka.
Precis.
Sen går vi ut och hålla på så här.
Ja, exakt.
Men, och den där handmikrofonen där, eller är det den här? Nej,
nej det är det inte.
Nej, det är bara det att de är trådlösa. Vad tog den vägen?
Jag ska prata väldigt nära, så här.
Höj lite.
En, två, tre. Nu är det dragen här.
Vet du vad vi gör? Vi byter den som står och snackar.
Ja.
Och har den till den här.
Det är jättehögt tror jag. Jag har 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Så sätter vi den här istället. Den snackar ju mest. Hallå? Ett, två, tre, fyra. Nu har vi gjort så här. Den Du hör, det är lite sämre i den. Men det funkar ju. Den andra som du hade var mycket bättre, så den satt där på grund av att de pratar ju, alltså ju mer, de pratar ju mer. De hörs. Och sen håller man
But also I saw that picture. I think you guys did. This one. No, it's such. I wanted to use that picture for this, or for the report. I wanted to read this. Actually, picture of the presentation. I thought it was about shot, but she used moving some things that I couldn't. Let's just look at it. See, use symbols text. Somebody who is raised in questions wrong and see. I remember the word of maybe it's
Nej, men jag har väl den enda riktiga test. Ja, det var den andra. Jag tror att vi... Där Johan! Ja, men precis. Men du kan inte bara springa Johan. Johan, vänta. Johan.
Jaha. Nej, nu går inte det tyvärr. Är det okej efteråt? Går det bra direkt? Nej, för jag måste nästan börja nu. Jag blev lite sen. Jag trodde den intervjun skulle vara mycket kortare tyvärr. Men hur lång är det? Är det liksom 1 minut eller? Nej, vet du vad du gör? Du drar in folk. Det tar 2 minuter. Du pratar. Vi pratar med honom. Så det tar alltid 1 minut.
Håll den framför ditt ansikte. Den här rapporten är viktig. Det här är ju reserverat. Skulle du kunna flytta tillbaka lite? 20 sekunder. Ja, lite. Där. Nej. Ja, den är ju samarbete med att presentera i Sverige faktiskt att lanseras här. Det är gemensamt. Det finns även den här mannen som ska prata om det. Han är från liksom Ja, den har ju passat den rapporten faktiskt. Och nästan inte så. Men det som är så komiskt är att vi hade så de jag tycker två saker. En är att det blir
Okay. Yes. Okay, everyone, we will start again. Please come in. Please come in, everyone. It's great to see that almost everyone stays. It's Friday afternoon, we are aware of that, but it's already dark outside and nothing to do anyway. Sorry for starting a bit late, to be honest. We were a bit overwhelmed actually, which is also very positive for the fact that we have strong media attention to this report, which is great. We need to get the message out. As Marcus said very clearly, a scientific report ending up on the shelf is not very useful. We have to get the message out in society. So we're going to have a policy panel, and I will not spend time really to introduce the panel too much in detail. I will of course introduce you very shortly, but Joel, Clement, if we could start with you, if you could come up, because you said you will help us, yes, help us to introduce here a little bit, bridging to the policy dimension, but also actually demonstrate that the US has tried already quite hard to take the next steps to see how the whole resilience thinking can be integrated into the work of the Arctic Council. So a warm applaud to Joel Clement from the Department of Interior.
Thank you. Thank you. Johan did mention that applause wakes everybody up, so I could really use that. Thank you very much. It's been a good trip over here. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Johan. I'm particularly delighted not to be in Washington, D.C. right now. So thanks for the break from that. I bring greetings and congratulations to the team here from the Department of the Interior in the U.S., the Secretary Sally Jewell, Department of the Interior Secretary John Kerry from the State Department, and his whole team working on the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, particularly Dave Baldwin and Julie Gorley, our senior Arctic official. Everyone is just extremely impressed with this product, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But I do want to jump in quickly and say I came to resilience in a sort of an unusual way. I was working for a private foundation back in 2004, and we wanted to get a better handle on the organizations that we were investing in back then. So we invited a couple of the experts from the Resilience Alliance up in Canada to come down and walk us through the adaptive cycle and talk about organizations and rigidity and creative deconstruction and that sort of thing. So I had this in my past, and when Sweden announced this initiative in Nuuk, my ears perked up and volunteered to represent the State Department in some of the early meetings, not knowing I'd end up co-chairing the project, but very pleased that it worked out this way. This collaboration has been really fantastic, and it's already been described. What a great group of people, the authors, Marcus and his team, the leadership at SEI, all that you have all done, delivering a world-class product. I'm very proud to be associated with. So congratulations to you all, and thanks for delivering this during the U.S. chairmanship. That's very handy for us as well, because who knows what we'll be able to announce next year. So I also want to thank you and your teams for staying engaged on the what next question, because this is something that I in particular am focused on as a policy director at DOI. We need to take this beyond science into practice, and were it not for the continued engagement of this team, I wouldn't be standing up here talking about a collaborative framework for building resilience in the Arctic, which is indeed what I'm here to do. So kudos to this team for constructing the underpinning for the framework that I'm about to describe, and many thanks to everybody for that. So why do we need an organizing framework for Arctic resilience? This is something we talked a little bit about at the Senior Arctic Official meeting in Portland, Maine a couple months ago. Certainly 2015 was a big year, a landmark year for advancing climate change issues and resilience. We know the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction was signed by the UN parties in March of 2015. And then in September, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, that was signed. And then, of course, the Paris agreements. So what a year that was. Incidentally, all of those agreements featured resilience language and resilience metrics. So the term and the use of resilience has really blossomed, and 2015 was a big year for that. But at the same time, various different regions were working on their own resilience strategies, whether it was disaster risk or for other reasons, the Pacific Islands, parts of Africa, Europe. These regional resilience strategies started to take shape, but nothing for the Arctic yet. The area warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. No strategies yet were being developed, and this was very evident to us as we were working on this report. So while the world was finally learning about the Arctic because of all the impacts up there, the loss of sea ice, the melting permafrost, and so on, far less aware of what actors in the Arctic were doing about those impacts, and other than suffering, right? I mean, we'd certainly hear about that, whether it were 80,000 reindeer dying because of a frozen tundra or villages being washed away due to exposure and melting permafrost. So with good reason, the parties and folks started looking to the Arctic Council for more on that. What are these actors doing? And as you saw from Sarah's slide, there are a lot of reports. The Arctic Council has delivered on a number of fronts as it relates to both climate change and related issues around sustainability. So there's a lot happening. The ARA is certainly, I think, the most momentous in recent years, but there's certainly a lot of work been done on biodiversity, connectivity, marine protection, and climate change adaptation. So all these studies have been taking place. But what's missing is a way to capture all these efforts in a collaborative framework that will build out a community of practice on resilience and identify some of those shared priorities and those gaps that need to be addressed, and then leverage one another's work. So that's what I mean by a collaborative framework. To get the ball rolling, the US Chairmanship sponsored a workshop last March prior to the Arctic Council meeting. Brought in a lot of experts. It was facilitated by none other than Johan, doing a fantastic job as always. We had voices there from all the various different Arctic sectors, and it sent a clear signal that indeed such a framework for action would add quite a bit of value. So the senior Arctic officials of the Arctic Council said, go ahead, get us a draft by September. So that may seem like enough time, March to September, but this was over the summer. It needed to be attractive to 8 countries, 6 working groups, 6 permanent participant organizations representing the indigenous people of the North, and numerous observer parties. So we had our work cut out for us, but it doesn't get any better than that, right? I mean, that's what you want to do. When you're doing international agreements, you want to get right into the meat of it. But sure enough, we had a calm, cool, and collected drafting committee chaired by the US, and then a review committee chaired by Finland. Thank you, Renee, and the Sami Council. All of the aforementioned parties weighed in on the process, and there was a fantastic back and forth, a lot of shared learning, a lot of feedback, some challenges, but we think the framework reflects a lot of good thinking. So this Arctic Resilience Action Framework, and I'm not going to give you copies because it's not public yet, and it won't be for a little while, and that's just the way it goes, but this is a teaser. We'll be delivering a final version to the senior Arctic officials in March, and then one hopes will be signed and announced around the time of the Ministerial in May, the conclusion of the US Chairmanship. The framework provides an outcome statement, a goal, a set of 9 overarching principles for building resilience in the Arctic that are largely derived from the work that took place within this group, building out this report here, and then 4 priority areas that include specific action areas. So it's a true framework. And while those principles provide key goalposts, and these are things like empowering local communities, incorporating and drawing upon indigenous knowledge, considering multiple scales, all the important things that we learned from this work here. The heart of the document is that set of priority areas. And if I had a slide, this would be it. The 4 priority areas. I'm just going to read them. The first one is the science piece, right? Analyzing and understanding risk and resilience in the Arctic. That's kind of a no-brainer. We know we need to prioritize things there. The second one, building resilience and adaptation capacity. Also very clear that we don't have the capacity in the North now to implement resilience measures across the board. Implementing resilience with policy planning and cooperation. That's the governance priority area. And then encouraging investment to reduce risk and build resilience. And while the problems are growing, budgets are shrinking in the public sector in particular. So we need to find some interesting opportunities within the world of modern finance to get these investments into the Arctic. And incidentally, I have a team of economists on my staff that are interested in partnering with another institution somewhere on unpacking some of these more modern instruments like green bonds, resilience bonds, and subsidized loans and things like that. So if any of you are affiliated with organizations that want to partner on that, we're all ears, and we have a proposal out there. So that's something we really do need to unpack. So those are the 4 priority areas. There are action areas within each, which you'll get to see when this thing comes out. And success is defined in our outcome statement, which focuses on an increase in the ability of Arctic states and Arctic communities to understand and respond to risk in ways that support ecosystems and prosperous and sustainable communities. So that's the fundamental thing we're trying to accomplish here with that framework. Implementation, of course, is the trick. It doesn't do much good if we're not tracking, evaluating, and adapting our shared efforts over time. So we'll have mechanisms in place, we'll propose mechanisms to track various commitments from the parties of the Arctic Council. Some of these commitments we already know. They're out there as part of these international agreements that I mentioned earlier. So we need to track those. So for the Arctic states, it's a little bit easier maybe, although we can encourage stretch goals. For the working groups of the Arctic Council, they may already be part of their work plans. So we can collect that information from their work plans. We'll again be encouraging through the senior Arctic officials, hopefully the working groups to take further steps. And importantly, we can't get too far without evaluating and updating this framework, right? We've established something that we think is important and dynamic enough, but there needs to be a way to take stock of our progress and adjust the framework. So we proposed a biennial resilience forum. We think that's an opportunity to share these best practices and take stock. And the great news is that Finland, thank you, Renee, has committed to holding the first of the biennial resilience forums during their chairmanship of the Arctic Council, which begins in May. So we're very excited about that. We've got a great team that will fall right into that work as soon as this thing is published. It's our hope that these efforts of both tracking and then evaluating will generate a community of practice that will help align the goals and metrics with those of other international agreements and identify specific targets and metrics for measuring progress. So we think there's a lot of opportunity there. So this is how we're mapping our way from the science of this report and others to implementing measures we think will improve the resilience of communities and ecosystems in the North. It's been just a super experience working with a great group of folks, all of whom understand that we need all of the tools and knowledge we can to overcome very daunting challenges in the North. So thanks again, Johan, for including me in the event. Many thanks to folks here for all that you've done. A couple of other thanks. I do want to thank the State Department for all their support. The U.S. Geological Survey has provided some funding for this work here. And on my staff, Sarah Abdelrahim was certainly very helpful as well. Many of you know her. So thanks again. I look forward to discussing this more with folks.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
You stay. You stay. Yeah. We won't let you go. We won't let you go that easy. So can I ask the rest of the panel to come up? And you can stand wherever you want as long as the minister stands in the middle.
Minister in the middle.
That's good.
I'll stand down.
So we have a panel that represents somewhat more the policy dimension. And thank you, Joel, for really giving us this, heads up for the framework coming. In an intergovernmental setting, this is actually quite unique in terms of rapid development, going from a scientific assessment or report to actually seeing a clear policy response. And I really would like to, highlight that you've been pretty bold here and, courage to drive this forward. So this is highly appreciated. On the panel now we have our Minister for Environment again, Karolina Skog. That's great to have you back here. We have Lars Ronnås, who is the Swedish Ambassador for Climate Change. You know, it has something to do with the Arctic, no doubt. We have also Andres Jato, who is the Arctic Ambassador of Sweden, of course, really connected to all the processes there. And we have Mr. René Söderman, who is the Senior Advisor, Arctic Cooperation, Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Finland. Finland is always important to us in Sweden, but it's extra important now because, as we have indicated, Finland will take over the chairmanship in May next year for the Arctic Council. If I can turn first to you, Minister Skog, we have now had these scientific presentations, the panel before the break here. From a political perspective, if you listen to all this, what is, and this is a simple answer, question, what is the kind of action you can take, you think, if you're looking at the political dimension?
Yeah, by producing this report, we have initiated a broader perspective. As mentioned in the panel before, I think continue and introducing this systemic approach in all the work of the Arctic Council will be very, very valuable. But also, I think it's also time to say it's time to get concrete in our actions. Although we obviously do not have all the knowledge of how this complexities works, we know enough to act. And I'm happy to say that now that this report is finalized, from the Swedish side, we will suggest that the next step would be to put wetlands in focus, to become more concrete and focus on a crucial area, which are all both affected and can affect climate change and resilience in these parts. And that is an example from our side on how we can get more concrete in the work.
That's a good, interesting point. We tend to focus on the ice when we talk Arctic, but of course, if you look at the landmass, about 60% of the landmass in the Arctic is actually consisting of different types of wetlands. So it's, so what you are suggesting is that it's also very important. We see that we need to create a framework, systems thinking. But what I really also hear from you, which I think is great, is to become also specific and understand the key systems and drivers as well, really.
And keep the systemic approach when you go down and become more concrete, but keep the systemic approach and continue talking about social aspect, economic aspect integrated with the ecological aspect, and have the true sustainable perspective on it all the way down to what you do on the floor.
Wonderful. Anders, you are the senior Arctic official. I think it's such a nice title. Oh, if I could ever be a senior Arctic official, I think all of us working in the Arctic always dream of this, senior Arctic official. It's such a nice title, but it means a lot of hard work. I know that, and you represent Sweden in the Arctic Council discussions when it's not a ministerial. And you followed also the Arctic Resilience Report process. We've had an opportunity to present it a few times. Now you listen to the final report. Can you say something about that connection to the political process in the Arctic Council, scientific process, and where you see potentially opportunities, but maybe still some challenges? Reflect quite freely.
Thank you. Now, first of all, I mean, you were in both Portland and...
Speak close to the microphone, I see.
You were both in Portland and Fairbanks, where we presented, or you actually presented, aspects of this project together with Joel, and I think that one could conclude, and I was a little bit surprised actually that it was such a strong support from basically every member state and the PP for this project. Maybe in the beginning, I wasn't there at that time, but I heard from others. Some people were a little bit reluctant. Maybe they didn't understand fully the meaning of resilience and the use of resilience. But now that has changed, I think. So there is a strong consensus right now, I think, in the Council that this is something that we should work with also in the future and try to integrate it into the Council's work. So I'm hopeful, actually.
Can you, I mean, because you are really at that bridging science policy. I mean, you're a key person in all that. Is it something you can point at why you think we have actually been quite successful, not yet to see a lot of actions because it's coming, but at least changing the perception and getting this concept into a political process? What do you think has been important in that process? Are there any specific sort of learning lessons that we can draw?
First of all, because it's evidence based, and I think that even though we're apparently living in a kind of post-truth era, science has still some clout. So
thank you.
So in that respect, I think that the strong connection between science and policy is, of course, one reason. Another reason, to be honest, is that it's easier to talk about adaptation and resilience than to talk about mitigation. So it's for some actors, it might be a suitable way to be active without having to take the really hard decisions about CO2 mitigation and so on. So there are several reasons, but.
And I think that's an interesting observation, because if you look at the climate negotiations, at least, very, of course, in a general sense, it's actually easier to talk about mitigation than adaptation. So it's interesting that in the Arctic Council context, it's a bit different, but I recognize it. Lars, Arctic or climate ambassador, talking about climate, talking about other processes. We have talked about the SDGs today. We have talked about the importance of linking to Paris. In the Arctic Council meetings, this is quite obvious. It's a lot of connections nowadays, and Sweden took an initiative, for instance, which I think was really good, to bring Arctic to the Marrakesh negotiations as well. How do you see this scientific report? How can it also play into, for instance, the climate negotiation? Does it make any difference? Does it play a role to have these kind of assessments when we try to take the climate agenda forward on a global level?
Well, first of all, I can only echo what Andres say, that with this report and policy action needs to be based on facts and science. And this report provides a methodological framework on resilience, which I think is an important basis now. I think a challenge that we're up to here is that the global warming, which affects the Arctic, is not in a way within the reach of the communities to act on. No, it's coming from somewhere else. But also, we are distant to the Arctic. And I think there is an issue of perception that you need to address. And it was brought up here before. In your question, do we identify ourselves as an Arctic country? And maybe that's something that we should work on. No? It's interesting that the map as well I saw here, if we look into the future and we see the signs of the future in the Arctics, why don't we have a map where the Arctic is in the middle? I was brought up with a map with the equator in the middle. No? So that's the kind of way we understand the world. We don't have the capitals within the Arctic. If we had the capitals closer to the Arctic, maybe we would look differently.
So would you say, despite, for instance, the Arctic being an extremely good example on what can happen very quickly, we see tipping points, potential at least, is that influencing at all, you would say, for instance, the climate negotiations? Or is it just something happening in a distance and this is completely a political process?
I think maybe it should be it should be brought more to the fore, no? And maybe in the next panel report that is being put forward, no? We are talking about 2 degrees and going down to 1.5 in the best scenario. But here, these are changes already taking place at this stage, and we're talking about much greater changes in temperature. So maybe that's what we should be looking at, because it will have the implications for the overall system. So that's something I think it's important. I think it's important also to see what kind of platforms there are for the communities, the Arctic communities, to speak up at places like COP, the Marrakesh and the like. Yes.
René, as we indicated, Finland will take over the chairmanship, and what is sometimes a challenge in regional bodies or in in any intergovernmental bodies, talking about the G7 or the G20 or Arctic Council, is of course that the chair tends to have their own program, which means that sometimes things, okay, it's up there and then it falls and then there's a new thing coming. But you have actually, which Joel alluded to, you have also indicated that you want to take the resilience agenda forward. You have offered to host the first forum. Can you say a few words about the Finnish chairmanship and how and why potentially you see it's important for you to take the resilience work forward in your chairmanship?
Yes, thank you. First of all, you have to understand that being a senior advisor means that I'm a layman, also in resilience. I'm capable talking about everything in that sense. First time I got into resilience was actually with Joel and Marcus in Arctic Frontiers soon 2 years ago, and have to go back then home and look up in the dictionary what resilience means in Finnish, how you would translate it into Finnish. There is no good word for it in Finnish. It would translate something like a surface that bounces back.
Oh, you see, not bad.
Not bad. But talking about the Finnish chairmanship, we presented the program at the Portland SAO meeting in October, and it builds upon 2 big themes and four smaller ones. And the 2 big themes are the global processes that are very important, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. So this is where we want to have the attention of the Arctic Council for the 2 years that we will be chairing it. The 4 smaller ones that you could talk about, like national priorities, they also have a connection to resilience. We talk about environmental protection, which is basically at the core of the Arctic Council mandate. We talk about telecommunications or connectivity, which also is a factor to build the resilience or strengthen the resilience of communities. We talk about meteorological cooperation, which can help northern communities to better adapt to sudden changes in weather, like the one that we have now seen a couple of days ago with the plus 20 degrees in Arctic Ocean. And we talk about education and cooperation education, which also is a key factor in strengthening the resilience of northern communities. I would like to go back to the one question about the diversification of the governance of Arctic issues, and it is a challenge of having different fora dealing with Arctic issues. But, for example, with the Sustainable Development Goals, we are all unified behind that through the United Nations. So that is one way of working towards strengthening resilience in the Arctic. Was this enough?
Yes, I think it's a very good point, because as you say, that's the really strength with the SDGs, that it helps us combine the entire system in a way. It doesn't create a new system.
And if I just may continue, Finland has been mentioned here a couple of times, and I didn't know if I have anything left to say. But yes, we are committed to arrange the first Arctic Resilience Action Framework Forum. I think it will take place in 2018. We don't know yet. It has to be discussed with the group that is working with this. But it will be sometime, somewhere in Finland, probably in the north.
And if I can ask you, I know you can't give a full answer, but let's say that there will be this forum. As a senior advisor, policymaker, what would be your expectations when we hold such a forum 2 years from now? Can you say a few words about that?
I think I need a couple of more words. The goal for that kind of forum would, in my view, be that it actually kicks the ball forward even further. We have now come forward with both this report and also the framework that hopefully will be agreed upon in March. But then always when we come to a certain point that we're actually looking back, we also have to be able to look forward and kick the ball in that direction.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Anders, you wanted to comment something?
Yes,
Short comment. Lars asked the question whether we feel like an Arctic nation or not, whether we have an Arctic identity or not. And so I think that what's going on in Sweden, in the north of Sweden right now, I think is very interesting. It's kind of an artification process, where you see where Norrbotten, for example, or most northern region, is developing its own Arctic strategy. They are starting to realize the importance of the Arctic and being a part of the Arctic. And when it comes to implementation of this resilience concept, I think the regions are actually exceptionally important. We have to somehow, because these are the guys who are basically building infrastructure, regional planning, organizing the school system, and so on and so on. I mean, they have an interest, I think, and they potentially have a capacity, if they get proper help and guidance, to implement regionally based resilience strategies. So I think that's one important way to go if we want to transform this from theory to real politics.
That's great. So you have to work at many different levels, clearly. It's interesting to see that. Joel, if I dare to ask you a question, which is it's difficult, I understand that, but it goes back a little bit also, and actually, Carolina, I would like you to maybe answer that as well, because it comes back to, again, what Lars and others have stressed. You know, how do we make sure that the countries, in the Arctic countries, in a broader sense, feel that they are connected with what happens in the Arctic, but also feels the responsibility of taking action? And of course, in countries where politics may change quite dramatically, in the US, this is a case in point. We've had that and may see it in Sweden. We've seen it in Canada, going in different directions. How do you, because we are talking about long-term building, resilience is long-term. It's about really, you know, strengthening societies. How do you do this in a complex political landscape? What would be your advice if you see for us as scientists? What are key triggers for us to make sure that we can connect to policy, which is quite often, or politics, which is quite often shifting? What are the successes to make sure it gets embedded in the political system in a way? It's a very small question.
That's a good one.
But can you give some advice? Because you're a government person. What do you see as success factors in making sure that when we want to see a change, which we are talking about here, it actually happens? Johan talked about getting Magdalena Andersson on board, our finance minister. That's one example of this. But can you give us some?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts, and this relates to the question earlier about our hopes going forward and where we have some degree of optimism, because we've certainly seen the ebbs and flows of political interest in climate change, but you know, where it's mostly politicized, as you mentioned earlier, is on the mitigation side. And we're internally trying to think, you know, how shall we continue with the resilience work that we're doing, even in the department? And ultimately, it's not partisan. I don't feel as threatened maybe as I should. I feel like this is essentially sustainable development work in a different, through a different lens. And this has to continue no matter what. In order, I think, for the science to take hold on the ground, in the field, I do think embedding policy folks in your efforts as you conduct these studies is very effective. I think that way you've got someone in the room thinking, okay, but then what? And thinking and raising their hand constantly and being really annoying to all the scientists in the room, because the questions that we're asking on the policy side are rarely the same questions that drive scientific inquiry, because they're not necessarily curiosity questions, they're problem-solving questions. And having that perspective in the room from the start can make a big difference. And also, of course, just in general, having these multidisciplinary groups working. Resilience lends itself very well, I think, to multidisciplinary work. And as Marcus and others have described, this is exactly what we need to do to build resilience. So I think having the right people in the room can get beyond some of the political stuff. Now, you don't want to have the higher up politicals who are going to be saying no throughout the process. You really want to have those, you know, the engaged, I would say career level, I don't know how it works elsewhere, but career level folks that are going to be sticking around, following through on this work. They may need to change their approach from time to time, but honestly, I think the work continues, and I think this is where I take hope, is that this resilience work is the essence of what we need to be doing, and this is how we avoid suffering. No one wants suffering, so I think there are some opportunities along those lines.
That's great. It's a good point. And Carolina, if you close your ears, I also tend to say, don't focus just on the politicians. Focus on the civil servants, because, as you say, they hang around for a long time. But politicians are important. So, Carolina, what do you say? I mean, what is your experience also? I mean, you work in a different political context, of course, but also here we have challenges to sometimes really get these kind of broader policies into government in a broader sense. What are the opportunities you see? How can we change that?
But first, your strategy is good. I can do absolutely nothing without my excellent civil servants. I rely on them every minute of my work, and I do see the connection between science and policy needs very much to happen on that level. And I come in on the closing seminar. That's where I appear, and it's a fantastic role. But I also want to emphasize, as Joel, the multi-science approach, because it becomes much closer to policy, of course, when you have a multi-science approach. And I often dare scientists to talk about money, reminding people that most of the policy decisions are either laws or money. It's not very complicated, and of course between that we do a lot of soft policy as well, but the decision itself are so. Don't hesitate to talk about money. Of course, I think it's quite clear in one of the examples here that Kiruna is a quite resilient city. Why are they wading in money? It's not very difficult to shift a town when you have somebody just paying it. It couldn't be done without loads of money from the mining. And you need to understand that, of course. The other point I also want to, has already been made, but I want to say it again, is about the regional level. Focusing not only on the state level, but also on the regional level and the local level is really, really important. Because politics is not one level. It's an ecosystem of its own. And in these cases, the regional and local level is very, very important. Where politics on the national level can shift very quickly, it is more stable on local and regional level, much more consensus oriented, and of course much more down to the ground. And keeping that level in mind, I think is very important. And I think it's very clear now where we're standing. I was in Marrakesh and I met a lot of mayors and I met a lot of business leaders, and they all gave me very much hope, saying that we are on the climate route and we won't stop working. We will do the work in our cities, in our companies. So the climate agenda is very much led by local, regional and private leaders, and they are very, very important. Because, of course, in this work, collaboration is essential, both within the Arctic control, but above, and in different, including different sectors in the work, is also crucial.
Thank you very much. And you can hear that Carolina has been a local politician before, speaking passionately about this. So that's a really good and important point, I think. We are trying to say that in many cases that actually the transition is already happening. So if a couple of countries stop their transition work in terms of climate change a little bit, it's not that dangerous any longer, maybe, because companies, cities, so many other actors are driving this agenda forward now, which is great. It's a positive development. Lars, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes, well, first of all, I'd like to say I think it's been very inspiring and learning for me these 2 hours here. And I say that with the risk of now kicking at an already open door, so I'll pose it as a question. One thing that was brought up here was the Brundtland report some 40 years ago. And I think perhaps there is some comparison, because at that time in the early 80s, we had arms race, nuclear arms race, and which also posed an existential threat. And there were a number of reports coming out emphasizing what do we have in common. The common security, the common responsibilities, the Palme Commission and the like. So maybe this is already something you are working very much on the Arctic Council, but that kind of concept, what brings us together as we also have competing and rivalries, is that a concept to be worked on, so to speak? I don't know.
I like it. I mean, in a way, I see the SDGs as being exactly that. In a world that really did not demonstrate itself on the Paris agenda, but the SDGs much broader, really focusing a lot on conflicts in the world, we still managed to get the SDGs and read the SDG document. It's a beautiful document for being a UN document. And I'm always saying, I don't think almost any heads of state read that document before they signed it. But it's so beautiful, actually. It's great. And not just the goals. Read the text. The text. Going back to what was it Marcus or someone said, people are not reading any longer. But read the text. It's a UN text, which is beautiful. Sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. You get, now I know the minister has to leave at 4 sharp. Renee, you have to leave at 4 sharp. It's 57. I give you 10 seconds each to just give your strong recommendation from the policy side to the scientist. When we take this work forward, what do we need to think about? What is key? Give us your 10-second. So you have your opportunity, because we always kick up at you. Now you can kick down.
I think you have to make it concrete.
Concrete. That was even 5 seconds.
Took my words out of my mouth.
Since it's Friday, it's the economy is stupid. Don't forget the money.
Connected. Lars.
Well, each report, there should be policy recommendations that we could pick up.
So policy relevant policy recommendations. Joel, because you are our distinguished international guest, Nordic is close, from the US. I give you the final word.
Oh, I love this. I love having the final word. Thank you. First of all, I want to say you're in very good hands with Carolina. I'm very impressed with all that she's had to say. So this is good news. To hear a minister talk the way you have is fantastic. So I will say that. Second of all, I want to echo that all change is local, and I think we need to emphasize that, bring resources to the local regions. I think this group has done a fantastic job moving these things along. So keeping that ball rolling in that direction is the right thing to do to reduce suffering.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's 3:59. And I know you have not been able to ask this panel questions. This is completely my fault. If you're upset, angry, you want to tweet, poor moderator, lousy, do so. It's fine. Don't blame anyone else. It's my fault. Said. So what is also my fault is actually that you get a reception. So it's compensation for that. But first of all, I really would like us to give a warm applause to this panel. You have been very open and shared with us your thoughts. Great. And thank you to all speakers. If you want to talk to them, you have still Johan Rockström standing over there, who one of the co-chair, Joel, one of the co-chair, the minister maybe needs to rush, we'll see. And we have all other people here, other authors, wine, it's Friday, the Arctic is melting, the depressive side, wine, the positive side. So thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for Johan.
Some final applause for Johan. Thank you so much, Johan.